Good day, good day. Once again, this is Pastor Theo with another mini midweek meal. I hope and pray that you all had a blessed Mother's Day. This is a recap of a message that served as a precursor to the message for next Sunday, which is on Pentecost Sunday, when we look at the traditional account that took place in Acts chapter 2 in regards to the disciples being empowered by the Holy Spirit, and the evidence of that was them speaking in tongues. And we want to have a better understanding, a more accurate understanding of why it took place and exactly what took place. In order to do that, we must go back and get some more context. So today I started off in Genesis chapter 9. And in Genesis chapter 9, verse 1, God had said to Noah that he had blessed him, and he gave him some sons, and he commanded that they would be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. So Noah and his sons, especially the sons, were commanded to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. We read that in Genesis chapter 9, verse 1. In verse 18, what we read is a recount of that, and it says that Ham, Shem, and Japheth, who are Noah's son, that they had multiplied and filled the earth. So we just read chapter 9, verse 1. We read the command to go out and multiply, fill the earth. In verse 18, we read that that's exactly what they did. But it's important for further context that we understand that they didn't do it willingly. God had to intervene. And it was part of God's intervention that set up the need in the future for God's Spirit to be poured out and to empower the disciples to speak in tongues. And we're going to read why that was necessary. And we read that in Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9, which is the account that we read about the Tower of what we would call sometimes Babel. It's actually Baval in the Hebrew. So we read about that account. And what we read was that there was a time when Noah's sons, as they were populating the earth, they moved to this area that was a plain, which means it was very flat. It was not mountainous. And we read that they had one language and one speech. That one, ahad, in the Hebrew means numerically one. It also means that they were united on one accord altogether. So they had one united, unified language, which in the Hebrew, the word would be safa. And that literally means lip, and it can mean the physical lips. It could also mean speech. It could mean language. So they had one unified speech, lip, or language. And then we also read that they had one speech. And that speaks to utterances, sayings. That was this word, davar. So they had one speech, mannerisms of sayings. But they were all unified with this one common language. And we read that they eventually, when they settled upon this plain, they devised a plan among themselves to make bricks, because they didn't have the mountains that they could carve the stone out of to build, so they made bricks. This speaks to their ingenuity, their intellect, their resources, their power. God gave them some abilities, some intellect, some power, some ingenuity, and they saw a need and they were able to envision what they needed, and then they did that thing. They made these bricks. And then we read that they said, now let us make a city and a tower for ourselves. And this was the next logical step, but it shows you that they weren't satisfied with making the bricks. They was like, we're going to make a whole city, make a whole tower. And we read the two reasons why they wanted to make the city and the tower was, number one, that they wanted to make a name for themselves. The Hebrew word for name is Shem. They wanted to make a Shem for themselves. which is problematic because the people of God are supposed to be wanting to make a name for God. They're supposed to want to exalt him. But instead, they wanted to make a name for themselves. They wanted to become famous. They wanted to have a reputation. And then they said the second reason was that they would not be scattered abroad. So instead of going out, they wanted to have a central location that they could stay. So they were going to build this city. Well, we have read in Genesis 9:1 that he called them to go out and about to multiply, fill the earth. Yet now we're seeing them being disobedient. Instead of going out, no, they're going to double down on the place that they're at by building a city. This was their way of saying we're going to settle right where we're at, which would be disobedient to what God had called them to do. So then we read that God said, let us go down and see what is going on. Let us see this city and let us see this tower for ourselves. And this is what they call anthropomorphic language. Anthropomorphic language, which simply means we speak about someone who is not a human in human-like terms, and we do so because it gives us a better understanding of that thing. In this case, God. God is not like us, but we speak about God as though he was like us, and it gives us a better understanding of how to relate to God. And so we know that God is omniscient, means all-knowing. God is omnipresent, which means he's everywhere. So we can't truly fathom his all-knowingness and his everywhereness. So when there's a time when God needs to intervene, we'll use language such as God went down and did this. And we see this in the Bible where God literally does come down. There are several accounts in Exodus where we read that he was in a cloud and he came down, descended upon the people, or spoke to Moses or spoke to Aaron when he was in the burning bush. So there are accounts where God literally comes down in a different form. And we don't mean form as in he shifts, he changes shapes. God is God, but he inhabits this cloud, this bush, to speak to his people. This is not one of those cases, one of those theophanies. This is just anthropomorphic language, which is just our way of saying stuff that makes sense to us. Because if we were in need, if someone showed up, we would say they came down and investigated. Well, this is just a roundabout way of saying that God investigated. He was concerned. And what he investigated was the fact that the people have built these bricks, and now they're building a city, that there's nothing going to be withheld them. There's nothing they're not going to be able to do if I don't intervene. And if I don't intervene, they're going to continue down this path, and this path leads them to continued disobedience. Because I'm telling them to go out, everything they're doing up until now is going to hinder that process because they're getting too comfortable with the place that they're at. And then we literally read the next line. It says, and God went down to confuse their language. And this is how we know he didn't literally go down, because we read up here that God went down. He investigated. Then the next line we read, and God said, let us go down again. So did he go down, come back, go up, come back down? No, it's literally just saying, figuratively speaking, God got involved. God interrupted. And it says that when he interrupted, he confused their language. He mixed up their language. And that is why that location then became known as Babel, the Tower of Babel, or what we would say Babel, because God confused their language. And in Genesis 11, every time we see that there was one language, that is the Hebrew word sapha, which means lip, which means speech. It means language. And in the Greek, if we were to look in the Greek Septuagint, that would translate to the Greek word halos. So sapha, lip, language, speech, is also Greek halos. Why is that important? Well, I know studying in the book of Acts, chapter 2, when it says they spoke in these tongues, that's the word glossai. And I was hoping that when I looked at Genesis 11, that Hebrew word sapha would be translated glossai in the Greek, but it's not. It's actually hylos. But interestingly enough, if we go back just one chapter to chapter 10 and we read verses 1 through 5, we're going to read an account of the genealogy of Noah. We read about his sons, and then we read about his sons' sons. And it says that they were all separated, scattered, each according to their own language and their own families. And this is in chapter 10. Well, the Tower of Babel is in chapter 11. So some people think there's a conflict, a contradiction. How are they being scattered in chapter 10 according to their own language? But in chapter 11 is when we're having languages being created for the first time, these different languages. Well, the easy way of understanding it is that what we read in chapter 10, verses 1 through 5, and then on, is a summary of what happened. Here's the people who were born. Here's the families who populated, and they were scattered according to their own language. And then what we read in chapter 11 is a more detailed account about how that happened. So imagine if you were somewhere in the city and maybe there was a big event and you didn't get a chance to go to this event and you asked someone what happened, but you didn't have a lot of time to go into detail. They would give you the Reader's Digest version. This is what happened last night in general. That's what we see in Genesis 1 through 5, the general overview of what happened. And let's say later on you call that person back and you got more time. You say, well, break it down to me. And now they may go in more depth about what they had explained earlier. They're going to tell the full story. They're going to give you all the details. That's what we see in chapter 11, a more detailed account of what we read in chapter 10, 1 through 5. Why is it important? Because every time in chapter 11 when it mentions one language, that's Sapha in the Hebrew, Hylos in the Greek. Well, this time in chapter 10, when it says he scattered them or he sent them out each according to their own language, that word is no longer Sapha. That word is Lashon, which where Sapha meant lip, language, speech, Lashon means tongue. And in the Greek word, that's glossai, the same word you're going to see in Acts chapter 2. So when it was unified, when it was one language, that was Sapha or Hylos. But when they got scattered and he changed and confused their language into multiple languages, that is now represented by the words Lashon in the Hebrew, glossai in the Greek. That's going to be very important, because what happens is now that God's people, as well as the Gentiles, which is what is mentioned in chapter 10, that they were Gentile coastal people, when they get scattered out, when they go abroad all over, what we're going to see in Acts is the first time where a lot of those people continue to come back for Passover. And we're going to learn that the disciples had a call that they would have to spread the gospel, to be witnesses of Jesus in all these places, the uttermost parts of the world, starting at home and going abroad. Well, there's going to be one major obstacle, and that's the language barrier. Because now there's no longer one language, one Sapha, one Hylos, but there are multiple languages, multiple Lashon, multiple glossai. And because of that, there's going to have to be a provision for the disciples to be able to speak in these multiple languages to spread the gospel. And we're going to learn more about that next Sunday when we look at what happens on Pentecost. And this is vitally important, because if we don't have an accurate biblical understanding of what tongues are, as well as other gifts of the Spirit, as well as what is ultimately the role of God's Spirit in our lives, we're going to misuse, abuse, and miss out on the true power that God has, because we're going to, unbeknownst to us, accept a false counterfeit power. So it's important that we have context that God wanted them to go out. They refused to go out. They wanted to stay. He changes their one language into multiple languages and sends them out. But later on, that's going to become problematic in terms of how the disciples can spread the gospel. But God is going to provide a way in order to do that. And we're going to see that way next Sunday. Once again, this has been Pastor Theo with another very important mini midweek meal. Take care and God bless.